In the US, the Democratic National Convention was held in Atlanta, Georgia, to nominate the party's candidate for the 1988 presidential election. They overwhelmingly chose Governor Mike Dukakis of Massachusetts with just over 70% of the vote, with Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen as his running mate. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, often spoken of as a potential first black president, was second with just under 30% of the vote. The other early frontrunner, Gary Hart, had dropped out after newspaper revelations of an extramarital affair, while Senator Joe Biden of Delaware had also dropped out early after criticism that, among other mistakes, he'd plagiarised part of a speech by British Labour leader Neil Kinnock made during the 1987 general election campaign. Midfielder Paul Gascoigne became the first British footballer sold for over £2 million when he moved from his hometown club Newcastle United to Tottenham Hotspur. Gascoigne had only turned professional 3 years earlier and was first called up to the England under-21s in September 1987, scoring on his debut against Morocco. While it passed unnoticed in the West at the time, the anime movie Akira was released in Japan and became a solid box office success in its home country. An English-language dub was made and given limited release in the US and a wider and slightly more successful release in the UK, but it was not until its release on home video that the film began to acquire cult status and critical acclaim. It's now regarded as a classic of Japanese animated movies, and credited, along with the works of Studio Ghibli, whose My Neighbor Totoro had been released in April, with popularising anime and manga in the West. And the city of Dublin celebrated its 1000th birthday, having made the anniversary the theme of the Eurovision Song Contest held there in May. The exact choice of date was somewhat arbitrary and remained a bone of contention among historians, with modern archaeological evidence suggesting that the first recorded Viking settlement on the site in 841 was actually preceded by an earlier Celtic Christian settlement. The Old Norse name for the settlement, Duvlin, is thought to derive from the older Duvlin, meaning the Black Pool. I apologise for whatever horrors I just visited on the Old Norse and Irish languages. Nigel Mansell's move to Ferrari seemed to have set off an early silly season, with Thierry Boutsen announced as Nigel's replacement, but otherwise lots in the way of rumour and little in the way of actual hard fact. Michele Alboreto to replace Patrese in the other Williams? Or leading a new two-car Scuderia Italia team? Aerodynamicist Frank Durney tempted away from Williams to rescue Ligier in exchange for a whopping paycheck? Lotus talking to Porsche about engines? Mercedes contemplating getting back into the game? Martin Brundle returning? Brabham returning? Gustav Brunner to draw next year's Zakspeed? Would there even be a next year's Zakspeed? That last rumour predictably led to an outburst and threatened lawsuit from Gunter Schmidt. In amongst all of that, the teams headed to West Germany to begin the second half of the F1 season. The weather was very hot and humid as the teams set out to dial in their cars on Friday morning. McLaren had been testing at Hockenheim between races and reversed or revised some of the aerodynamic changes that hadn't worked out for them at Silverstone, while Prost arrived at the circuit still fuming after having been lambasted in the French press for cowardice after retiring from the British race. Lotus were trialling some new Bilstein shock absorbers that could be adjusted in the cockpit by the driver, while Benetton had a revised rear suspension setup to correct oversteer under acceleration. Ferrari had remapped their engine and dialed back the RPM by about 1,000 at John Barnard's advice to try and solve their fuel consumption woes. Michel Tetu had been beavering away in the wind tunnel and produced a qualifying special version of the Ligier with smaller fuel tanks, smaller radiators and a high airbox. And Heini Mada had finally figured out the problem with the pop-off valves on the Arrow's Megatron engines. They'd been mounted incorrectly at the beginning of 1987, and nobody had ever checked that. And there was potentially trouble brewing at Eurobrunn, where the Euro racing team had tried to replace Walter Brunn's protégé Oscar Larrauri with Christian Danner for Hockenheim, only for the German to be too tall to fit in the car, so the Argentine was rather sheepishly rehired, and there were faces like thunder all around the garage. Larini went into pre-qualifying for the first time and easily topped the table, 0.7 seconds ahead of next quickest Caffi, with Tarquini's Coloni the odd one out for the third race running. But the fastest driver of all throughout all the sessions was Senna, who took pole position, his 7th in 9 races this year and 23rd overall. Prost was fired up and pushed him hard all the way, ending up second, just 0.27 seconds behind, and in third place was Berger, a whopping 1.5 seconds off Senna, with Alboreto fourth, a full second and change off Berger's time. The Lotus could at least go quickly in a straight line, so Piquet managed 5th, with Nannini best of the Atmos just ahead of an excellent Capelli. Nakajima was 8th, then Boutsen and Gugelmin in the other Benetton and March respectively. The Williams, still using their makeshift suspension from Silverstone, could only manage 11th and 13th, sandwiching Warwick's arrows, with De Cesaris again doing well in 14th. Arnoux had a much better qualifying in the new car, lining up 17th just ahead of Larini, a very encouraging 18th in the Azella, and both Zach speeds would be on the grid for their home race, with Schneider 22nd and Ginzani 23rd. The Eurobruns made up the back row, meaning that the four non-qualifiers joining Tarquini on the pit wall would be Johansson, Bailey and both Minardis, Sala and Martini both complaining of a mysterious handling problem. After the session, Andrea De Cesaris was hauled before the stewards and torn off a strip for clocking 120 miles an hour in the pit lane on Saturday, and then overnight there was a terrific thunderstorm with torrential rain, big booming thunderclaps and truly impressive lightning strikes. Come Sunday morning, the sky was still overcast, the air damp and chilly, and it looked a lot like rain. Everyone was watching the skies nervously, having spent 2 days perfecting their dry setups, and with the window to decide on tyre choice rapidly closing. The half-hour morning practice was dry, but over lunchtime the rain started once more. A wet race was declared, although it was looking as if it might clear up later on. Nelson Piquet decided to gamble that the track would dry out and started on slicks, but everyone else was on wet tyres as the lights went green and away they went, with Prost getting away slowly and dropping behind Berger and Nannini, while Senna burned off into the lead as usual. The visibility was so poor behind the leaders that Derek Warwick later recalled that he was driving entirely by the engine note of the car in front of him, and it was no great surprise when Piquet skated backwards into the tyre wall at the Ost curve on lap 1. He kept it going, but only to save himself the long, wet walk back to the pits. So, at the end of lap 1 it was Senna, Berger, Nannini, Prost, Alboreto and Capelli, followed at a bit of a distance by Boutsen, Mansell, Warwick, Patrese, Nakajima and Chiva. Senna was already pulling out a significant lead over Berger, whose engine note was sounding a bit ropey, and the field was already beginning to string out as most drivers dropped back and waited for the track to dry out a bit and allow themselves some more visibility. It had stopped raining by now, and the track was indeed starting to dry in places, and lap times were coming down, as Senna had pulled out a gap of some 6 seconds over Berger by lap 5. Prost, meanwhile, had closed right up on Nannini as the track continued to dry, and Senna was already starting to seek out wet patches to cool his tyres. The key decision would be when to change to slicks, but it was still wetter on the far end of the circuit. The director left the camera running at the Ost curve on lap 8 to show the gap between leaders, and Prost came past ahead of Nannini. On the same lap, Alio made the call and was the first in to change to slicks, hoping to steal a march on the rest. Mansell was going well, having passed Boutsen for 7th and was bearing down on Capelli, clearly hoping to repeat his Silverstone heroics, but maybe it was still a bit early to change to slicks, as Alio aquaplaned off at the same place as Piquet, having moved off the dry line to let Senna through. After 10 laps, just under a quarter distance on this long circuit, Senna's lead over Berger was up to 10.6 seconds, with Prost now just a couple of seconds behind the Ferrari in closing, setting the fastest lap in the process. Soon he was right on the Austrian's tail as the Ferrari's back end stepped out coming out of the first chicane. Again, the cameras missed the overtaking manoeuvre as the pair disappeared into a ball of spray and emerged the other way round, and once more it was the McLaren's first and second. Prost had 3/4 of the race left to try and make up a deficit of some 12.6 seconds, which would be quite a tall order on a damp, slippery track, but the tyre change call could be vital. With relatively little going on the track, the RTL director took the opportunity to give a bit of airtime to the all-German Zach Speed, driven by Bernd Schneider, and De Cesaris running 13th in the semi-German Real Ford. Alex Caffey had a puncture in his right rear tyre and had to drive almost the whole lap on 3 wheels back to the pits to get a new one. Not bad driving in the conditions, as Prost tried to chip away at Senna's lead and Senna responded. Mansell's progress was rather halted when his gearbox got stuck in 5th, and he came slowly into the pits to have it looked at. The team made some repairs and sent him back out, only for him to spin into the grass at the stadium before finishing his outlap. As usual, Senna was quicker through the traffic than Prost and pulled out a couple of seconds as half-distance approached, and umbrellas began to open in the stands as it started to drizzle again. But only drizzle, dampening the track again but not really getting it properly wet, which just added to everyone's tyre dilemma. De Cesaris spun off in the stadium section and rejoined, and indeed at half-distance there were still 22 cars running as the slower speeds and cooler temperatures of a wet race helped preserve the car's components, and the fairly straightforward track layout gave relatively little scope for driver error. The second half of the race wore on without much change on track, as the top 6 hadn't changed since Prost moved up to second, and the drizzle came and went, hanging between the trees on the long arcing straights. By now, as three-quarters distance came and went, Berger was nearly 30 seconds behind Prost, who was still failing to make much of an impression on Senna, who seemed nailed on for his 5th win of the year, especially when lapping a recalcitrant Nakajima cost Prost 4 seconds on one lap. Berger similarly was forced right onto the grass by the inexperienced Schneider, but was fortunate to suffer no ill effects, except to his calm as he shook a fist at the rookie once he'd recovered the car. The race had been over as a contest for some time, but when Prost put a wheel on the slippery curb and spun, that cemented it. Prost got moving again with nothing lost except 10 seconds or so on Senna, and that was that. Petrozzi on worn wets spun off in the closing stages, and Streff and Dalmas retired with throttle and clutch problems respectively on laps 38 and 39 out of the 44. Nannini had looked set for 4th until one of the mounting brackets on his throttle came away. He went in to have it repaired, rejoining last and 4 laps down, and proceeded to drive like a man possessed, setting the fastest lap just before the end, but not managing to pass Arnoux to take 1 place back. Senna cruised home for another lights-to-flag victory, with Prost following home for yet another McLaren 1-2, and Nannini's misfortune meant that Berger and Alboreto made the top 4 the same as it had been on the grid. Capelli took 2 points for March, with Boutsen up into 6th to salvage a point for Benetton. Warwick came in 7th after a quiet race, followed by Gugelmin, Nakajima and Chiva, with all 3 German cars finishing well, the first being Schneider, his first Grand Prix finish in 12th, just 1 lap down, although presumably dreading a word with Herr Berger in the pits afterwards. So Senna closed to within 3 points of Prost and had 1 more win on the board, while Alboreto's 3 points put him back ahead of Piquet in the standings as Benetton likewise pulled a point ahead of Lotus.